Tonight I'll be talking mainly about the past. I assume those of you who came here tonight are interested in the past. But by Wednesday we'll be very much in the thicket of the present, which is a fast-changing present, as you are all aware. And I hope you will stick with it, because I think it's up to you to decide whether what I have to say is worthwhile, but I think the topic that I'm talking about is certainly of great importance to all of us. I want also to thank the committee, the Public Lectures Committee and the Princeton University Press for this invitation, and I was very much struck right from the outset about the appropriateness of this locale for, have I destroyed something already? I'm going to try. For the topic that I'm talking about. Princeton, as I'm sure many of you know, was one of only 9 colleges in the United States when the Republic was founded. Today there are roughly 4,391 to be exact, according to the last stats in the Chronicle of Higher Education, though as Stan was just intimating, I'm not sure that there'll be that many next year at this time. Among them, Princeton's longevity, its distinction, its commitment to undergraduate education, even as it evolved into a great research university, make it certainly an ideal context for what I'm talking about tonight. Now, my subject, like death and taxes, I would suggest, seems always to be with us. In fact, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that college has become a permanent presence in our lives, from the toddler's first standardized test. If you live in New York City, I don't know how it is out here, but I have a lot of friends with small children who are taking standardized tests at age 3 and 4 and worrying about the preschool that they're going to go to and what the implications will be about their prospects for going to a college like this one. Anyway, from the toddler to the yellow, bald, and these are not my words, toothless meetings in memory of red cheeks, black hair, and departed health. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson's description of his 20th college reunion. I like to believe that men aged a little faster in those days. I'm past my 35th reunion, and I don't much like that description of myself. But anyway, it's with us all our lives. A few weeks ago, when we were waking up every morning to learn that another bank had failed overnight, even then, college news managed to break into the headlines when a group of administrators announced they were thinking of discarding or at least demoting the SAT as a means for choosing who gets into college and who doesn't. The best week of the year for your local news vendor, I would guess, is the week that the U.S. News and World Report College Rankings issue comes out with its list of the best party colleges, the best green colleges, the best for minorities, best for cost versus value, and of course the list of lists, for whatever it's worth, the best of the best, on which Princeton usually finishes either number 1 or number 2. If you go home tonight and Google the word college, even if you screen out irrelevant hits such as Electoral College or College of Cardinals, you run the risk, I think, of overloading your computer processor. When I tried it a few days ago, I got 52,800,000 hits, and that was, I think, a slow day. Now, when I say that college is always with us, I think you know what I mean, and those of you, if there are any undergraduates here tonight, I can't quite tell, there might be a sprinkling, you'll soon find out. The development office will make sure you have a lifetime bond with Mother Princeton, which I can promise you will feel like surveillance when some chirpy undergraduate calls you at home 30 years or so from now and wants to know very sincerely how you're doing tonight. Mostly, I think we take it all for granted, and we don't think very much about college once we've gotten our kids in or figured out how to pay for our grandchildren. I know highly intelligent people who've been to places in the world that I couldn't locate on a map, or who actually understand what a credit default swap is, but who don't have even a rudimentary sense of where America's colleges come from, or how they have evolved, or where they seem to be headed. Now, in some respects, they haven't, in fact, evolved very much. A few days ago, I read an interview with the president of Johns Hopkins, who said the following: if you went to a Hopkins class circa 1900 and you went today, probably the only difference would be today we have PowerPoint. I think I disappointed Hannah a little bit when I said I wasn't going to show any pictures tonight because I'm hopeless with PowerPoint. He went on to say it would look exactly the same, but if you went to an automobile plant in 1900 and today, you wouldn't recognize the place. Maybe not the best counterexample given the state of the auto industry since he gave that interview, but in fact, the point is a fair one. In a book nearly 450 years old called The Schoolmaster by the English scholastic Roger Ascham, you'll find the statement that the right time to go to college is age 17. That was the norm in 1560. 2.5 centuries later, the average age of the Harvard freshman class had dropped to 16 and a half, a change that I think we could agree is statistically insignificant. And at least for middle-class Americans, and I want to stress that point because I'll be talking about other college-goers in the next couple of lectures. But for middle-class Americans, the norm remains just about the same today. So there are lots of things about college that seem timeless. And in fact, there's a sense in which our colleges want it that way. Campus architecture, and I'm very conscious of that walking onto this campus, tends to look to the past. It's Neo-Georgian or Neo-Gothic, as it is here in Princeton, or Neo-this or Neo-that. And we remember college as a place outside of time, a sort of Camelot, Eden, and Shangri-La all rolled into one, a time of sexual and maybe intellectual awakening, when it's always spring and the harshest sounds are the reciprocal thump of tennis balls and the clatter of cleats as young bodies trot up and down the field house steps. It's a place where days start late and nights never end. I had forgotten that last fact when we sent our son off to college some years ago, and one morning around 6 a.m. I got an email from him, and I was very excited, and I went running in, and I think I woke up my wife and said, at last, he's figured out that he's got to get up early and get the day going and really stay on top of things. And as the words were coming out of my mouth, I realized, of course, he had never gone to bed. Now, there's something distinctively American about these feelings and associations that I've just gestured toward. The college sweatshirt is as much an American icon as the Golden Arches or the Super Bowl. In Europe or Asia, you find young people who've never been anywhere near, say, Chapel Hill or South Bend, wearing Tar Heel blue or the insignia of the Fighting Irish as if they were alums of UNC or Notre Dame. And when European friends come to this country, I find they're often amazed, not just in metropolitan centers such as Cambridge or Berkeley, but in small towns like Conway, Arkansas, home to a very excellent liberal arts college called Hendrix College, or Danville, Kentucky, Center College, or Northfield, Minnesota, Carleton College, to find that around the corner, past the usual lunch dives and chain stores, there suddenly appears a verdant new world with few, if any, old world equivalents. Not some estate turned over to the National Trust by an old family whose old money has run out, but a campus you enter through a gate rather like the gateway to Oz, beyond which is spread out a magical alternative world. In some cases, such as Bennington College or Bard College, the college actually began with such an old family estate that was bequeathed or given to the college. On my own campus, Columbia, it's always struck me, and those of you who know Columbia will understand, as peculiarly appropriate that the oldest building on our campus, the Maison Française, was originally the home of the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum. Now, there's also continuing in this vein with your indulgence for another moment or two, a distinctively American literary genre, the college reunion novel or film, in which we preserve the kinds of memories that I've been talking about. Think of the baby boomer classic, The Big Chill, or pick at random from recent college novels by Louis Begley, Tim O'Brien, Alan Lightman. The list is always growing. There are distinguished darker examples, such as William Maxwell's beautiful novel, The Folded Leaf, or John Williams's haunting Stoner, that convey both the pettiness and passion of college life, or Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, which, as the title suggests, portrays college as a place of suffocation more than liberation. But by and large, these books and films, even in its way that classic of the cinema, Animal House, remind us with almost Wordsworthian poignancy of the bliss of being young and alive at that time of life when you leave your parents behind for a halfway house somewhere between the comforts and strictures of home and the freedom and risks of the world. Now, as time does its dirty work on us, perhaps we all need these memory fragments to shore up against our ruin. Think of Philip Roth's Ron Potemkin, who lived in his fictional world just up the road here in Newark, New Jersey, a different world from Princeton, but not so far away. You'll remember how he listens over and over to his favorite album of Ohio State school songs called Goodbye, Columbus. Or if you can't, as we say, identify with the fictional Ronnie Potemkin, how about the actual Anthony Kronman, former dean of the Yale Law School, who recalls in a recent book his time at Williams College, where he went to a weekly seminar at the home of a philosophy professor who, in his description, had two golden retrievers sleeping in sublime indifference on either side of the fireplace like bookends beside the hearth, while the sunset lit the Berkshire Hills in scarlet and gold. Something in all these memories suggests to me that our brains are programmed to screen out the traumas of college. The botched exams, the missed free throws, Ron Potemkin's case, the unrequited loves, that in truth make it a difficult time of life for many young people struggling to grow up. Right now, on some college campus, perhaps on this one, I imagine there's a course on the neurobiology of nostalgia. And if there isn't, there probably ought to be. All right, so part of my purpose, as you may have already surmised, is to put some pressure for the next 3 evenings on these hazy, lazy images that we carry around with us. Because if we surrender to them, we're not likely to think very usefully about an institution that is, in fact, of great consequence to our nation and thereby to the world, and that, I believe, is in very, very serious trouble. To begin with, if you've been thinking, as I've been speaking, that in fact most Americans never experience anything like what I've been talking about, you'd be right. The reality is that fewer than 1 in 7 American undergraduates lives on the kind of college campus that I've been describing. More than half of today's college students are, in fact, adults. We call them non-traditional students, attending 2-year community colleges or night classes, trying to hold down a job and or care for a family while getting an education. Roughly a third of American college students work full-time. More than half attend college part-time, typically majoring in subjects that they hope will have immediate utility in the now shrinking labor market, such as accounting or computing, an experience very far from Tony Kronman's seminar with its golden sunset and golden dogs. Only a small minority of Americans ever attend college on the proverbial leafy campus. That point has been made very vividly by Mike McPherson, former president of Macalester College, and Morty Shapiro, current president of Williams, who estimate that if you gathered all the students enrolled in a residential liberal arts college in the United States today, they would, and this is their formulation, fit easily inside a single Big Ten football stadium, around 100,000 out of more than 17 million. More disturbing, much more, I think, is the fact that the percentage of college-age Americans who never attend any college, large or small, urban or rural, is high and likely to grow. It's much higher than the fraction of Americans without health insurance or of those in prison, a couple of markers by which we sometimes measure the health, not just in the literal sense, of our society. The fact is, and this fact I suspect is probably already out of date since I wrote it down, that the United States, which once led the world in the proportion of its young people in college, now stands seventh, with Belgium, behind Sweden, South Korea, Norway, Finland, Japan, and Canada. And in the percentage of college students who complete their degrees, we rank even lower, coming in 15th, alongside Poland and Spain. Now, what does this mean, and why should we care? The usual answer is that having an undereducated population hurts our competitiveness in the global knowledge economy. And there's a good deal to that concern, obviously. I heard your President, Shirley Tillman, not long ago say that only 6% of American undergraduates, she said this in dismay, of course, only 6% of American undergraduates major in engineering or the physical sciences, while in China, the number is more like 40%. Her point, of course, was that we're at risk of losing our place in the global economy because we're falling behind in science education. And I'm sure she's right to be concerned about that. America's economic and cultural dominance in the 20th century, which I have a hard time remembering is no longer the century we're living in, but anyway, that dominance was directly correlated with the democratization of higher education, by which we sent more of our citizens to college than any society had come close to doing before. When Tocqueville came to America 175 years ago, he was struck, and I quote him, that primary education is within the reach of everyone, but higher education is within the reach of virtually no one. Over the course of the 20th century, we turned that description upside down. Today, however, we're slipping, both in higher and primary education for that matter, which means that, and I don't think this could be emphasized enough, for the first time in our history, we face the prospect that future generations of Americans will be less educated than their predecessors. That's not a good sign for our society in the 21st century. Now, one reason to care about all of this, which is a little different, I think, from the problem of staying competitive in the global economy, is that it's almost unthinkable today to make it, as it were, without college. The only example that I ever hear cited of somebody who's done pretty well without completing college is, you've all heard it, is, of course, Bill Gates, who left Harvard because he had better things to do. But, you know, that example makes me think, remember those commercials? You don't see those so much anymore either on television, of the sporty car that's careening around an icy mountain road, gripping the road like nobody's business. And on the bottom of the screen it says, "Caution, do not attempt to duplicate professional driver under controlled conditions." Right? That would be the Bill Gates case. Leaving that outlier aside, on average, those who hold a BA degree in this country earn roughly 60% more over their lifetime than those who do not. Now, America has never promised its citizens equality of condition. But it does promise, continues to promise it, equality of opportunity. And in the modern world, this is only a credible promise if it entails the opportunity to go to college. I'll be talking a good deal about these matters on Wednesday. Now, it's a little longer on this topic. In talking about why college matters, which I think is the title, something close to that, of these lectures, we might want to begin with the economic argument that I've alluded to, but I don't think we want to end with it. Let me try out a public health analogy. It's often said that eliminating smoking would save our healthcare system untold billions because the cost of caring for patients who develop lung cancer or emphysema or heart disease or diabetes from smoking is immense. And that's true, of course. But it turns out, in fact, that reducing the incidence of these diseases may end up costing us more. Kind of an odd paradox, but it might cost us more because people who don't smoke live longer and therefore eventually require very expensive long-term care in their old age. Now, of course, we want people to stop smoking and to live longer lives. My point is that measuring the benefit of college in the same way that we sometimes assess public health, that is, as a social cost or a social gain, doesn't quite get the point, or at least not the whole point. The best reason to end smoking is that individuals who don't smoke have a better chance to lead better lives. And the best reason to care about higher education is not what it does for society, though that's undoubtedly important, but what it does for individual human persons, both in calculable and incalculable ways. Which puts me in mind of an experience I had a couple of years ago when I was talking to a Columbia alumni group, which I do from time to time, and I was talking about our core curriculum, which I will also have occasion to make reference to in these lectures as we move along. And I was making what I thought was a reasonably good case, which you don't really have to make to Columbia alumni because they love the core, that the core made good citizens, and it made you aware of your responsibilities as citizens, and it introduced you to the great tradition of political thought, so on and so forth. And got to the end of my talk, and a rather elderly alumnus stood up in the back and said, "Professor, it's all very good, and you've said some things that are reasonable and so on, but you've missed the point." And so, with some trepidation, I said to him, "Okay, tell me what is the point I've missed." And he said in a sentence I'll always remember, and this is not a, blowing the horn for Columbia, which I'm not renowned for doing. He said, "Columbia," by which you might read college, "taught me how to enjoy life." By which he meant that he could walk into a museum and know how to look at a picture. He could go and listen to work by Sibelius and have some sense of the musical tradition that it came out of. And I thought that was a pretty good answer, and one that often gets lost in the somewhat econometric discussions that we have and that I was sort of imitating here in an amateur way about the value of college. In any case, part of what I hope these lectures will do is to question some myths by bringing them into contact with some realities, while as much as possible keeping the individual student at the center of the story. I will return periodically to the question of access to college education that I've broached tonight, but first, and this will be my topic for the rest of this evening, I want to go to the question of origins. What is this thing, college? I've used the word already probably 50 times, by which our worldly prospects are so much affected, at which we're likely to meet our spouses, make lifelong friends, and from which we take away the kinds of memories I've alluded to. Like any institution or idea, it has a history, of course, and I'm always inclined to think that if we want to understand where we are in the present, it helps to begin in the past. So that's where we're going to go now. It's impossible, of course, to say when this history begins. You don't have to be a postmodernist to know that assertions about beginnings and middles and ends are a little bit suspect. The idea that young adults should pass through a period of higher education before entering a life of commerce or service is much older than the United States, and older, too, than the English colonies that became the United States. Aristotle identified the years between puberty and age 21 as the formative time for mind and character. And it was customary for young Greeks, exclusively men, of course, in those days, to attend series of lectures that resembled our notion of a college course. In Augustan Rome, gatherings of students under instruction by settled teachers took on some of the attributes we associate with modern colleges: libraries, fraternities, even organized sports. And by the Middle Ages, efforts to limit the right to teach by issuing licenses, teaching licenses, were underway in such nascent educational centers as Paris and Padua, presaging the modern idea of a faculty with exclusive authority to grant degrees. In this broad sense, the history of college exceeds 2 millennia. Yet I think we can say with some assurance that college as we know it is basically an English idea. It first appeared in what was to become the United States when dissenters from the established Church of England carried that idea to New England early in the 17th century. To these Puritans, and that was the name at first that they were given by their enemies on account of their putative severity of mind and spirit, but after a while they stopped fighting against it and they accepted the name. They embraced the name. Said, all right, you call us Puritans, we'll call ourselves Puritans. Anyway, to them, education was vitally important. And while they knew more than a little about ancient and medieval precedents, they had particularly in mind their own experience in the colleges of Cambridge and Oxford. Those earliest English colleges, already older then than our oldest colleges are now, which is also worth chewing on for a moment, were essentially retreats for scholars of divinity whose duties included celebrating Mass for the soul of the benefactor who had endowed the college and thereby spared them from menial work. You might say, I suppose, that lectures like these are sort of vaguely derived from that tradition in which we're celebrating the memory of Stafford Little. Or to use a more familiar vocabulary, those early English colleges were essentially groups of graduate students on fellowship. But by the 15th century or so, it had become common for these resident scholars to supply or supplement their living by giving instruction and accommodation to younger students whom we would call undergraduates. These boarders, or as they were known at Cambridge, pensioners, might have been kinsmen of the college benefactor or candidates admitted on the recommendation of some trusted schoolmaster who spoke for their character and their competence in Latin. But however much they were vouched for, once they got to college, these undergraduates were closely watched and guarded. In this sense, college has always had, at least until recently, a certain penal aspect. Part school, part prison. You find historians of the 19th century American college talking about parents sentencing their children to college, which is probably not the way we think about it today. Already by the later 15th century, the cloistered structure of the Oxbridge College had emerged in the form we recognize: rooms accessible from an inner courtyard and connected by walkways to the chapel, library, and hall. College buildings were divided vertically by entryways, rather as I discovered this building is, because I had to go outside to go use the men's room, rather than by one main stairwell with hallways radiating out from it. The hall, a great room with rushes strewn on the floor to be gathered up from time to time and burned as a means of controlling the dirt, was the inner sanctum of college life. It was in hall that dining, lectures, and sometimes musical and theatrical performances took place, which puts me in mind of when my wife and I, we had a classmate by the name of Al Franken who's trying to get elected senator from Minnesota right now, and his first theatrical performances were in the Dunster House Dining Hall, which is a direct descendant from what I'm talking about. At one end of the hall stood the high table, where tutors dined in the company of the master, who, as the only college official permitted to marry, lived with his family in an attached house. In other words, part of the college experience was to witness from an enforced distance, close but only so close, the social and intellectual intercourse of one's superiors. Now the point, as in the Puritan churches, where the privilege of taking communion or participating in what they called the Lord's Supper was reserved only for full church members, while everyone else was expected to watch nervously from the pews, the point was to induce a sense of aspiration that someday I, too, will be welcome at that table. By having to meet a high standard of admission, or at least that was the idea, these hopeful spectators would want to assess and inspect and improve their own worthiness. It's a sin to come unworthily to the communion table, we find Cotton Mather writing in 1690. But it is also a sin to stay unworthily away from that blessed ordinance. They like to make you crazy that way. Here was a description of a kind of spiritual torture, the kind that was supposed to be good for the soul. While outside the inner circle of church or college, you should crave to be admitted. Once inside, you should worry about whether you really deserve to be admitted. Well, forgive my anecdotal mode tonight, but it's a small group, so you won't mind a little chatter of that sort. This story, when I was writing it down, reminded me of a quite remarkable breakfast I had some years ago with the eminent sociologist Digby Baltzell, man who coined the term Protestant establishment. I had breakfast with him in the Rittenhouse Hotel in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, and I was talking to him about some of these issues all the way those years ago. And at one point he leans over his Eggs Benedict or whatever it was, and he says to me, "Where did you go to college?" And Digby was a rather blunt, wonderfully blunt guy. I said, "Where did you go to college?" I said, "Well, I went to Harvard." And he said, "Did you think you deserved to go there?" Now that's a tricky question. It's a sort of a version of Cotton Mather's question, right? I mean, are you supposed to say, "Damn straight I deserve to go there. You know, I worked hard, I got high scores, and who else deserved more than I did?" Or should you do the sort of phony, false humility thing and say, "Well, I got lucky, and I'm sure there were many other people who deserved it." And so I'm kind of frozen in between these two alternatives, and Digby says, "Of course you thought you deserved to go there. And your whole generation thought you deserved to go to those schools, and you turned out to be the smuggest, most self-serving generation in American history." And then he went on in his typical vein and said, "When Jack Kennedy got into Harvard," and he forgot to mention that he came to Princeton first, right? "When Jack Kennedy got into Harvard, he knew he got in because of his daddy's money. And therefore, when he left Harvard, he had a sense of that he ought to give something back, and he knew that he really didn't deserve to be there with the bright kids." Now, that was an interesting take, which is not one that we're accustomed to, and I'll talk a little more about that in the next two lectures as well. Now, we talk all about the meritocracy and about how everybody who comes to places like Princeton and Harvard deserves to be here. Digby was a little skeptical of that, and I guess I am too. Anyway, sorry about that digression, but I've also often thought, since I'm sticking with the Puritans a little longer, that Samuel Sewall, whose name may be known to you as one of the judges in the Salem witchcraft case, when he recorded in his famous diary upon being admitted to the Third Church of Boston that he began to be, and this is his phrase, "afraid of myself." Quite a remarkable diary entry. He's just been admitted to the church, and he says, "I began to be afraid of myself." That what we're reading there is arguably the first instance in American history of someone reacting to the phenomenon of grade inflation. By which I mean, this is an honest student confiding to himself in his diary that he knows he didn't deserve the high grade that he just received in the form of church admission. For the older members of the audience, maybe the better analogy is that Samuel Sewall was a sort of early Protestant version of Groucho Marx, saying to himself, I'm not sure I want to join any club that would have me as a member. Anyway, in the Oxbridge colleges, particularly those with the Puritan flavor like Emmanuel College, from which most of the Harvard founders came, all this psychic drama about worthiness and unworthiness took place behind closed gates, out of public view. During their period of education or incarceration, whichever word you prefer, the initiates or inmates were kept in and the public kept out. Traffic flowed through a single point of entrance and exit, the Porter's Gate. Since such buildings could only be built at great expense, the earliest American colleges could not afford to emulate them. Thus, the squat, rectangular buildings that are the oldest surviving structures of our oldest colleges, Massachusetts Hall at Harvard, Connecticut Hall at Yale, Nassau Hall, which I think you also call Old North, here at Princeton. The best that Harvard could do, which is a startling thought about an institution whose endowment today is still nearly $30 billion, even after the market freefall, the best they could do was to build a 6-foot wooden fence around the yard, not so much to keep the cows and goats out as to keep the students in. Harvard and Yale had to wait till the 20th century to build their houses or colleges on the Oxbridge model. At Princeton, as I understand it, this project is still going forward, right? You're still creating undergraduate residential colleges. And I learned from Professor Maynard's book on Woodrow Wilson's presidency that you did begin building dormitories divided by vertical entryways, like this building, back in the 1830s, he says, with a view to preventing students from rolling cannonballs down the long hallways. Now, if early college architecture suggests a world of confinement, it was also a coddled and collegial world. In fact, that latter word, like the noun college, derives from the Latin collegium, meaning society or community, in which young men, denied, theoretically anyway, although they always found ways to get out, but denied the pleasures of town and tavern, were offered recreation in the college gardens, bowling green, tennis court, bathing pool, archery range, and so on. Life in college wasn't all that bad. By the 17th century, this was the world that produced, among others, John Milton, Oliver Cromwell, who is said to have toughened himself at football in the courtyard of Sydney Sussex College, and Isaac Newton. Pretty good alumni roster. The important point is that these men not only studied but lived at college. As early as 1700, Cotton Mather was drawing a sharp distinction between the urban universities of Europe, where students, as he put it, board here and there in private houses, and those of England, where students are brought up in what he called a more collegiate way of living. And this is still a distinction to this day between continental Europe and the Anglo-American colleges, by which Cotton Mather meant that they lived with each other and with their tutors. Now, in suggesting these commonalities between college and church, I doubt I'm saying much that you don't already know. But I think it's worth going a little further into the depth of the connection, since it's my impression that we often stop with the obvious point that early college students in the period I'm describing studied Christian texts and imbibed Christian doctrine. Sure enough, they did. But what I have in mind is a deeper affinity between college and church, a specifically Protestant affinity, by which I mean that the early American college shared with the Puritan church the principle of what I would like to call lateral learning. Now let me try to explain what that means. First of all, to the Puritans, a church, I'm sure many of you know this, so forgive me if I seem to be touching on elementary stuff. But to the Puritans, a church was not a physical structure made of wood or stone. They called that the meeting house. A church was a group of people gathered together to keep the sacraments and hear a preacher chosen from among the church elders. The minister was a member of the congregation whose authority came not by appointment from above, by pope or prelate, but, as one historian puts it, from the interaction of consciences among the church members themselves. The obligations of church members, in other words, were horizontal to one another, as well as vertical to God. They were expected to support and fortify and care for one another. Admission to the community was not based, at least in theory, on where you lived or who your parents were, but, anticipating the discourse of the modern college admissions committee, it was based on the judgment of those already within that you had, as one of the first Massachusetts Puritans put it, an aptness to edify another. Here we have a 17th century version of the question that the modern admissions committee asks. What does this candidate bring to the table or to the class? And the best candidates were those, again in 17th century language, who do, and I quote, not take any ancient doctrine for truth till they have examined it for themselves. This theme of self-interrogation lies at the heart, I think, of the Anglo-American educational tradition. The ideal student is not a disciple or an acolyte. He or she is inwardly restless, measuring the preacher's or teacher's claims against her own point of view, basing his judgment not on whim, although certain heresies within Puritanism seem to lead in that direction, but on serious reading and study and meditation. Truth claims were to be tested experimentally, put, that is, to the test of experience. Introspection, not in solitude, but in the company of other seekers, was an essential means for getting at the truth. Now, you find all kinds of traces of what I'm talking about, of course, in the history of American education. The very word professor, which some of us have on our business cards, goes back, of course, to the usage that meant a professor of the faith, right? You profess your faith in public, in fact, to become a member of one of these churches that I'm describing. We find a trace of this idea that I've been talking about also in, for instance, Randall Jarrell's quite amusing novel about Bennington College called Pictures from an Institution, in which the emigre professors recently arrived from Europe have a terrible time with this American notion that students actually have something worthwhile to say and therefore something to learn from one another. Again, I wouldn't presume to propose a starting point for this idea of what I'm calling lateral learning, but it's certainly older than John Dewey, it's older than Rousseau, and was already well developed in the minds of the Puritan founders, one of whom declared, "We have an oracle in our breasts, which if we would but rub up, would reveal all things to us." Think about the evolution of the discussion section, or what you call here the precept. It begins as they used to call it recitation, but it rather quickly evolves into a format, an educational format, where something is supposed to come out of the interaction of consciences in the room, and in the best instances it does. This is an educational principle that would prove especially congenial to American universalist and individualist ideals, and it appears in many variations in education writing, from the Alcotts to Dewey to Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Now, in many respects, this Oxbridge model of the college that I've been talking about, transported to Newtown, later renamed Cambridge, Massachusetts, after the university from which most of the founders came, thence to New Haven, and from there to Princeton, which I'll have a little more to say about tomorrow, it all may seem to belong to the distant past. It came from an English world where college students had a rendezvous with each other scheduled from birth. The cloistered, inbred world we still associate with England in such representations as Chariots of Fire or Brideshead Revisited, a world we've left far behind. Yet the fundamental idea of college as a gathered community, a collegium, the idea that college is about the mutual edification of its students, was adapted to the new world and has never been abandoned, at least not in theory. Last time I checked, Harvard's promotional literature says something to the effect that if you come to Harvard College, you will learn more here from your fellow students than from anyone else. And unlike much of the boilerplate, this is actually true. With all due respect to the Princeton faculty, of whom there may or may not be a representative in the room besides Stan, I'm sure it's true at Princeton as well. Now, of course, none of these ideas is inherently or exclusively Protestant. We hear a version of it from that Catholic convert Cardinal Newman, who wrote of the ideal university as a place where, as I quote, students are brought by familiar intercourse. The weight of that word in its relation to the idea of family. Familiar intercourse into a relation where they learn to respect, to consult, to aid each other. We hear it from Dewey, raised in Vermont as a Congregationalist, who defined education as a mode of social life in which the best and deepest moral training is precisely that which one gets through having to enter into proper relations with others in a unity of work and thought. We hear it from William Perry, founder of the Bureau of Study Council at Harvard in the mid-20th century, who discerned and developed in a lot of writings a 5-stage schema of intellectual and moral development in college students that remarkably resembles the morphology of conversion by which Puritans described the stages of the soul's journey toward salvation. Writing 300 years after the clergyman who I've been quoting, Perry reports that a key sign of maturity, usually not evident till the senior year, is the student's genuine recognition that there's something to learn from his peers. Now, these ideas and emphases may seem self-evident since they've become part and parcel of educational policy and practice in the United States. They are, as I say, at the root of what an admissions office in a selective college tries to do in shaping a class, putting together a group of students who complement and strengthen one another. A similar idea, I would suggest, since I believe that ideas matter, underlies Justice Powell's majority, bare one-vote majority in the Bakke decision some 30 years ago, when he found a compelling public interest in what we now call affirmative action, on the premise that achieving diversity in a racial sense is a legitimate public good, which permits consideration of race as one factor in college admissions, with the view of creating a true community of learning that is better for being diverse in that sense. Now, I'm coming down the stretch run of today's talk, and I've said, as you will have noticed, perhaps with relief, almost nothing about what early college students were actually expected to learn in a more narrow curricular sense. I've done this in part deliberately, in order to avoid talking as if college and curriculum were one and the same thing. I hardly need point out to you, especially during those years of what we call the culture wars, that a lot of polemical ink was spilled on the question of what books college students should read or shouldn't read, what facts they should know, what exams they should pass. And these are not trivial questions. And yet I think everyone knows that the last thing we remember from college is the content of the classes we took. My good friend Saul Gittleman who was provost of Tufts University and a beloved teacher there for many years, said to me the other day that he's always touched when students will come back to see him after many years and say, "Professor Gittleman, you changed my life." And then when he says, "Really, that's wonderful. What is it you remember from my class?" the answer is almost always nothing. Can't remember anything. Just the atmosphere. Something about you. Still, it would be negligent not to say at least a little about what college students in this early period were actually expected to learn. So to that end, I want to look for a moment at what we could call the first fundraising campaign statement in the history of American education, in which the founders of the first American college explained their purpose. It's a document that I'm always moved by, called New England's First Fruits. After God had carried us safe to New England, and we had built our houses, provided necessaries for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, and settled the civil government, one of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. Now, the learning they sought to advance and perpetuate was, of course, in large part theological learning. Appropriately enough, almost providentially, it might seem, the only book from John Harvard's library, which was the main part of his bequest to Harvard College, the only book to survive an 18th century fire was a tract by a writer called John Downham entitled Christian Warfare. And when I was a graduate student rummaging around in these thickets a very long time ago, I once went to the Rare Book Library and ordered up a copy of Christian Warfare to read it in the days before this stuff was available in digital form. And I waited, and it was kind of longer than it usually took, and no one was bringing me the book. And I started to notice these kind of big guys coming into the room who looked like Secret Service types, and they sort of surrounded me at the table and started to ask me why I wanted this book. And I realized that I had inadvertently ordered the one surviving book, and it was okay, I would read it in another edition. So everything was all right. Still, even though that kind of book was at the center of the experience, it's a mistake, I think, to imagine that the first American colleges were seminaries devoted solely to doctrine and dogma. The study of logic and ethics, classical as well as Christian, took up a considerable part of the students' attention, as did arithmetic and geometry. An early appeal for funds for the Harvard Library enumerated the need for volumes on law, physics, philosophy, and mathematics. Along with Augustine's City of God and Calvin's Institutes, library holdings included Erasmus's Colloquies and even the bawdy comedies of the Roman playwright Plautus. Here at Princeton, early student libraries included Virgil, Xenophon, and Cicero, and there are records of students acting Nicholas Rowe's popular play Tamerlane. In short, the American college was conceived from the start as broadly civic rather than narrowly sectarian, with the aim, as the historian Samuel Eliot Morison put it, to develop the whole man, his body and soul as well as his intellect, toward the formation of a person inclined, and these are Morison's words, to unity, gentility, and public service. Public service is a theme that I will be returning to in the next couple of evenings. Still, religion, and I don't think there's a contradiction here, came first. To read the Bible was to parse God's Word, no small task, since in what Christians called the Old Testament, God spoke through shadows, types, or umbra of truths as yet unrevealed. And in the New Testament, he spoke through parables and prophecies, requiring informed interpretation. Yet colleges were more than Bible schools, since God expressed his punitive or protective will not only through the words of Scripture, but through the record of history, pilgrimages, wars, and the judgments of nature, floods, earthquake, drought. And he conferred on all human beings the capacity for responsive pleasure at natural intimations of his supernatural excellence. The symmetrical beauty of plants and trees, the ripples that flow outward in perfect circles when a stone is thrown into tranquil water. And so the natural world was also the object of study, filled as it is with what Jonathan Edwards, Yale class of 1720, appointed president of Princeton in 1758, called, and I quote, "beauties that delight us and we can't tell why. As when we find ourselves pleased in beholding the color of the violets, but we know not what secret regularity or harmony it is that creates that pleasure in our minds." It should probably be said parenthetically that Edwards and before him Cotton Mather, these were not people uninterested in the scientific investigation of nature. And as you probably know, Cotton Mather was an early advocate of smallpox inoculation, so he was perfectly open to the idea that the human mind could learn more about the way the natural world was put together and even intervene in it in a certain way when permitted by God. And as you all know, Edwards died upon taking the smallpox inoculation, I think just a few yards from this building. Slightly more macabre note that I've often wondered, in the Puritan tradition, one would be expected to draw a lesson from this phenomenon. And I'm not sure whether the lesson is you should sacrifice yourself for your students, because it was said he did it in order to encourage his students to inoculate themselves, or you should draw the line and go only so far for your students. But I leave that to you to decide. In any case, the early American college, as I've been suggesting, required the study not only of texts, scriptural as well as patristic, but also of history and natural philosophy, a tripartite division of knowledge that corresponds roughly to today's triumvirate of humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. A college aspired to be a place, this is Cardinal Newman's formulation, where all branches of knowledge are connected together because the subject matter of knowledge is intimately united in itself as being the acts and the work of the Creator. The subject matter was nothing less than what Edwards called, in a usage that anticipates what the word would eventually come to mean, and it's a word I'll be using a lot tomorrow, what he called the university of things, by which he meant the wholeness of creation. I'm sure it will strike you in listening to those phrases about the interconnectedness of things that in our contemporary colleges it's a struggle to achieve that sense. The fragmentation, the sense you go into a field or into a discipline and it doesn't really have anything to do with what somebody else is doing in another field or discipline. This aspiration toward wholeness makes me think of a beautiful essay by the historian William Cronin, the title of which he takes not from Edwards but from E.M. Forster, Only Connect. A way, he says, of defining the aim of a liberal education, enabling the mind to see and make connections among seemingly disparate phenomena, to make sense of the world, and I'm quoting him, and act within it in the service, and there's that word again, in the service of human community. Now, on this view, which I share, and I suspect many of you do too, the purely cognitive aspiration toward what today some call consilience does not exhaust the meaning of the college idea. To the English mind, as Morrison wrote, university learning apart from college life was not worth having. And the humblest resident tutor was accounted a more suitable teacher than the most eminent lecturer. Book learning alone might be got by lectures and reading, but it was only by studying and disputing, eating and drinking, playing and praying as members of the same collegiate community in close and constant association with each other and with their tutors, that the priceless gift of character could be imparted to young men. Now, today, the assertion that a college should be about imparting something called character is likely to strike us as an empty platitude, and possibly a pernicious one, something that comes from another time and world. What, after all, is character? It's a very vague word, and it has an unsavory history. It was during Morrison's undergraduate years that Harvard's president, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, proposed, and I quote, a personal estimate of character on the part of the admissions authorities in order to control what he called the dangerous increase in the proportion of Jews. This was the time when the top floor of one of the dorms in the yard where number of Jewish students lived, became unaffectionately known as Kike's Peak among the undergraduates. Might be worth pausing also to remark that some of the traditions, and I guess that goes back to my opening remarks about we take college for granted and think it's always been the way it is now. Some of the traditions we just assume, such as the reference letter, the letter of recommendation that comes into the admissions office from the high school college counselor when you apply to college, the origin of that tradition is in fact an ugly one. It begins as a way when Jewish students started to apply to these places, and they had high test scores in many cases, and they came from schools, they didn't come from Lawrenceville, and they didn't come from Choate. They came from schools where the admissions officer, there was probably only one at the time, the dean, didn't really know the school, didn't know the counselor. So they asked for letters of recommendation, which they basically read for evidence that they were dealing with a Jewish candidate. So these reference letters that we think of as progressive and as ways of presenting the whole person so that you're not just a number and so on, originate for a different purpose. So then as now, even if for the most part we've gotten past the kind of overt bigotry that we hear from President Lowell, judgments of character tend to boil down pretty often to how comfortable the judge feels in the presence of the judged. And yet, I think if we can get past these unsavory associations, and I think we ought to, we must recognize that a true college should entail the conviction, as Cardinal Newman put it, that education, as opposed to mere instruction, implies, these are his words, an action upon our mental nature and the formation of a character. This is at the core of the college idea, and it always has been. College has always meant more than brain training for this or that functional task. It is based on the premise that when students come to college, they're not yet fully formed as social beings, and they can be enlarged not only by books and teachers, but by each other. That conviction entails, in turn, the prior premise that their transformation into responsible and generous adults, something like what the Puritans called conversion, is at least to be hoped for. The hope is that some experience, not merely intellectual or even social in the colloquial sense of the word, but civic, in the sense that I've been speaking about, some experience will deepen and strengthen and transform them at college. Of course, there are no guarantees. No college can ensure that its graduates will emerge with this thing called character, and no one can predict which students will be struck or touched or constructively disturbed by what they read or learn from their teachers or from each other. True education works only by invitation, never by coercion. The Puritan founders, and I think everyone in this tradition seriously interested in education ever since, also knew that however excellent the teacher, only some students will respond to the invitation. From Calvin to Henry Adams, the estimate is not very many. 1 in 20 maybe. So other teachers have a more optimistic view of the possibilities. William Perry, whom I mentioned earlier, liked to remark, and I like this formulation, that every student in my class has a completely different teacher. By which he meant that something utterly mysterious happens in that space between the teacher and the student, something that neither can control consciously, something not amenable to representation on the transcript or the diploma. Two students can hear the same words from the same voice. They can study the same text, even receive the same grade, even graduate with the same honors. And yet, to borrow another Puritan phrase, a marvelous difference exists between them. Doesn't matter if we describe it in the old language of theology or in the new language of developmental psychology. The fact that students can be touched and inspired as well as trained and informed has always been the true teacher's aim and joy. But every teacher also knows that there's no telling who will catch fire or why. You put your words and thoughts out there, and then if you're very lucky, something, I used the word lucky, shouldn't probably, something, the Puritans called it God, we call it luck. Something determines that some of the students are forever changed by the experience, while others, as Perry puts it, go all the way through college and somehow manage to remain schoolboys to the end. Now, I've tried to raise a few questions today about our present relation to the past. Tomorrow, and I'll hope at least some of you will come back, I will move rather quickly through what remains of the past into the present. But before that, in closing, let me just suggest that among the questions that I'd like to leave you with, there are many in my mind, and I hope some in yours, one would be, is there today any sense in which the disciplinary aspect of college that I spoke about still exists? Should we miss it if it doesn't? I think we would all agree that today the number of punishable infractions on any college campus is so few. Even rules against the academic sin of plagiarism are only loosely enforced at most institutions. So few that most contemporary students would be astonished and indignant if a teacher or dean presumed to intervene in their private lives for purposes of doctrinal or moral correction. The era of spiritual authority belonging to the college is long and in most respects, no doubt, well gone. The role of loco parentis has shriveled to almost nothing. It struck me in my rummagings around that it's interesting to me that the New York Times, over the course of the last year, ran no fewer than 2 prominent editorials which they tried to address this issue. And the way they addressed it was to denounce colleges and universities for not protecting their students from predatory credit card lenders. That is, keep those bastards from coming onto campus and waving these 20% credit cards in the faces of your students, which is fair enough. They probably should be kept off campus. But it's also possibly a complicated issue, just as the question of whether ROTC recruiters should be kept off campus. But it struck me as interesting that the Times sort of zeroed in on that as the one way in which they could think that colleges should still intervene and protect their students from moral corruption. Another question to keep in mind might be a broader one, I guess. What's the future of the idea of college as community in our secular and highly dispersed age? I haven't spoken much about it. We'll get back to that. But given the millions of students who don't attend colleges that are anything like the ones I've been describing this evening, but who attend colleges at night with virtual strangers or go to college online, is there any way that this value of community, if we still believe in it, could be replicated or approximated by digital means? What does community mean to today's students, whom a recent book calls digital natives? You all know what that means, right? My daughter has to go to the doctor because she's got what seems like carpal tunnel syndrome from sending the 900 text messages that she sends every day. This younger generation's social relations are totally different from what ours were. They're largely virtual. They never really make the break that earlier generations did from their community of high school friends or even from their parents, because they're in touch with all of those folks all the time, electronically. What's the fate of this idea of community in our mega universities, where most of our undergraduates attend college, or even in the liberal arts colleges, all of which are under pressure to expand, to increase their revenue flow, to admit international students? Most of all, though, I would ask you to think about what one university president recently called the former moral mission of college, which he says appropriately, I think, has been reduced at most colleges to a ghostly presence. I like that phrase. On my own campus, there's one place where I always think I feel the presence of the ghost. That's in and around a handsome domed building built around the turn of the 20th century that has these words inscribed across its facade. I never noticed the words till I had been at Columbia for almost 15 years and started to think about this stuff, and I've never met a student who has any idea what's written on the stone over the door. It's the building that still houses the office of the university chaplain, and what it says is, erected for the students that religion and learning may go hand in hand and character grow with knowledge. Now, we know that the religion part is really anachronistic. I mean, Columbia has lost touch with its Episcopalian origins long ago, and that's mostly fine. But what about the character part? Is there still some meaningful way in which character grows with knowledge in a college like yours or mine? I have the sense that that building is really a memorial, a monument, maybe even a crypt. And I guess my question as we go forward, or at least as I go forward with these lectures, would be, what might it mean still to believe in the ghost who lurks around that building? Thanks very much.